We continue now at the top of Daf Chav Tesam Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 29a. On the previous summit, Rav Yosef said that the source, according to the Rabbanon, for the idea of 3 years of Chazakah is from Yirmiyahu, where Yirmiyahu says, make sure you have a star, because you're only going to have this particular property for 2 years. That shows that 2 years is not a Chazakah, and so we can infer that maybe 3 years is a Chazakah. But Abaya says back to Rav Yosef, how do you know in Yirmiyahu? Maybe he was just giving good advice. Maybe he wasn't saying a halacha like Cheskas Gimel Shanim. He was saying advice that you should have a star. And the Gemara now continues with Abaya's argument, to Ilotei Mahachi, because if you don't say that, the pasuk over there in Yirmiyahu also says, it says benu vatim, it says build houses, v'shevu, v'nitu ganos, v'ichlu espirion. It talks about building houses and settling, etc. And that certainly is going to be an idea of good advice. My Kamar, what's Yirmiyahu saying over there? El Eitza Tova Kamashmalon, he's giving them good advice. Hachanami here also, Eitza Tova Kamashmalon, he's giving them good advice. And Rashi explains, Dilo te mahachi, if you don't say this, Hare Shalach Yirmiyahu la'osan shahayu bebavel, Yirmiyahu sent to those who were in Bavel, Shagalu im Yechanya, who were exiled with Yechanya, Yud Aleph Shana, Kodem Galus Tzidkiyahu, 11 years before the exile of Tzidkiyahu, he said that pasuk, he said, Benu Batim V'shevu, build houses and settle, Kilo Seitzu Misham ad Melos, LeBavel Shivim Shana, because you won't leave there until it's finished the 70 years in Bavel. And so Lama Leila Hazirim Alzos, why did Yirmiyahu have to warn them about this? Eitza Tova Kamashmalan, he's obviously giving them good advice. To Meisi Osam Hachanami, Eitza Tova Bialma here also, it's just an Eitza Tova, and so therefore again you see this idea. And the Gemara continues, Teda, you should know this is true. And Rashi explains, Teda, the Cholatzmo Hayagel Yatzam Eitza Tova, you should know that it's true that Yirmiyahu was trying to give them good advice. To Kamar Lunam, because he also says to them, Makom Genizah Shtaroseim Hechanem Miskaimim Yoser, he tells them where they can store their documents, that they will last, that they will be preserved in the best possible fashion. Again, Teda, you should know Dechsiv, because it's written in the pasuk also Yirmiyahu, Unesatem B'chli Cheres, you should place them in Kli Cheres, in earthenware vessels, Laman Yamdu Yamim Rabim, in order that they stay, they're preserved for a long time. And so again, you can't really say that this pasuk in Yirmiyahu is actually the source. And so the Gemara continues, Elama Rava, rather Rava says, Shasa Kamaisa Mochel, the idea of 3 years Chazakah comes from the following. The first year a person is Mochel, Tarti Mochel, the second year also a person is Mochel, doesn't say anything. But Tlas Lo Mochel, but 3 years already, a person is not going to be Mochel, and so that's the idea. If the person is there 3 years on the property, he establishes this Chazakah. Rashi explains, Mochel Inish Al Peiros Karko, the person is Mochel in terms of the produce of his land, La Adam Ha'ochlan, to the person who's consuming them. That's the idea of the 3 year Chazakah. And so the Gemara continues, Amar Le Abaya says, Elameata, but according to that, Ki Hodra Ara, when the land is returned to Hadr Levar Mipiri, then let's say the person does get the land back, he should get it back, but he shouldn't get the fruits, because apparently he was mochel on the fruits. Rashi says, Elameata Kevad Da'atrei Shenin Mochel, if the idea is that on 2 years a person is mochel, Ti Hadr Ara Mimishi Yotzal of Irer, L'sof Shnasayim, let's say there is a protest after 2 years and the land is returned to Hadr Ara Lebayim Levar Mipiri, so the land should return to the owners with the exception of the produce. The person shouldn't get back the produce to Hamochel Le'alayu, because he was mochel about them. And so therefore he says, if that's the case, again, it should be with the exception of the fruits. But Allah Ma'am Rav Nachman, so why did Rav Nachman say Hadra Ara v'Hadra Piri? He said the exact opposite. He said that the land returns and the produce is returned as well. And Rashi here says, Allah Ma'am Rav Nachman l'kamon b'shmaitin. Why did Rav Nachman say later on in the sugya? And there's a note over here, Adkan Perish Rashi, Zatzal, until here is the explanation of Rashi. Mikan V'elach Perish Rabbeinu Shmuel B'Rabbi Meir, from here forward is going to be the explanation of Rabbeinu Shmuel B'Rabbi Meir, which is the Rashbam. It says in the Mesoras Hashas, B'defus Pizru HaNusach Kan Meis Rashi, says that there are those that have the Nusach that's widespread, that over here is where Rashi died. In any case, the Rashbam continues, Allah Amar Rav Nachman, why did Rav Nachman say L'kamon B'shmaitin? Later on in the Sugya, Gavi Machzik B'karka Chaveru, it says a person is making a chazak in the land of his friend. V'yazal idach v'yaisi sahadi dachlin tartin shenin. And now the other one comes and he brings witnesses that he's been there 2 years. V'lo yoser, not longer. V'yamar Rav Nachman hadra ara v'hadra piri shal shtei shanim. Rav Nachman said the land and the produce of the 2 years is returned. And so the Gemara continues. Elo amar Rava, rather Rava says the idea of 3 years of chazak is as follows. Shasa kamaisa lo kapid inish. For the first year, a person is not mak, but he's not strict about it if somebody's on his property. Tarti lo kapid, the second year as well, he's not strict, but to loss kapid by the third year already, the person is strict. And Rashi explains, Tarti lo kapti al mashaze yored l'soch sadeyu. The Rashbam rather explains, for the 2 years, the fact that this person's on his property is not strict. But nevertheless, he's not mochel on the fruits. He's not strict about it, but he's not mochel the fruits. He's entitled to get it back. To lost kapit, but already the 3rd year he is strict. Since he does this corruption, since he does this sin already 3 times to be there without the permission of the owner, if this other person is quiet in protest after 3 years, he certainly must have sold it to him at that point in time. That's why after 3 years we say that it is a chazaka. But the Gemara continues, Abaye said back to him, but according to that, what about those from the household of Bar Yoshev? The Kapti, they are very strict about things. Even somebody who goes over their boundary. Are you going to say that for those kinds of individuals, immediately it's a chazaka? If you're going to say, yeah, indeed, that's the case, it's an immediate chazaka when you're dealing with the people of this household. And if that's the case, so then you have to say it's different for every type of situation. You don't have an exact amount for chazaka, really. And that would not be a proper thing to say. So the Gemara says, Rava says, Shasa kamaisa mizdar inish b'shtari. The real reason is as follows. For the 1st year, we say a person is careful with the shtar. Tarti utlas mizdar, person. Also the 2nd, 3rd year, they're careful. But tefei lo mizdar. But more than that, they're not careful with the shtar. That's why after 3 years, you actually do have a chazaka. And Rashi and the Rashbam explains, Hachanami de la alter to have a chazaka. Are you going to say by the Beibar al Yoshev, it's an immediate chazaka? Lemisha yard lenichsi, the Beibar al Yoshev, hoel velomichu. Somebody goes to the property of Beibar al Yoshev and there was no protest. Are you going to say it's immediate? Again, that can't be because nasata devarech l'shiurin. And so again, the Gemara says now Rava's answer that the idea that a person is careful with the shtar for the first few years, but after 3 years already, there's a concept of chazaka because we say a person is not careful. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaye. So Abaye said back to him, but according to that logic, if a person protests, let's say not in front of the defendant, not in front of the person who's on the property, that should not be a good protest. Because he can say to him, had you protested in front of me, I would have been careful with my shtar, meaning to say, the person can say, the whole idea of chazak is that a person is naturally not careful with the shtar after 3 years, and therefore in this case as well, since you protested not in front of me, I didn't realize you protested, so I wasn't careful with my shtar, and so therefore that kind of macha shalo b'fanav, that should not be a good macha. A person should have to do a macha b'fanav. He should have to do the protest in front of the person on the property. That way the person knows that he has to be careful with the shtar, and that way he can't develop this chazaka. And the Gemara says to that, the Yamarle says to him, Chavra Isla, your friend has a friend, V'chavra Isla, and the friend of your friend has a friend, meaning even if it's not in front of him, he will hear about it, and that's why the protest does in fact stop the chazaka. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Huna says, Shalosh Shanim Sha'amru, when we talk about the 3 years of Chazaka, Hu Sha'achlan Ritzufos, those 3 years that the person establishes a Chazaka, they have to be consecutive years. It has to be 3 consecutive years. The Gemara says, My Kamashmalan, what exactly is Rav Huna teaching us? Tanina, we already learned that in the Mishnah. It says, Chezkasan Shalosh Shanim Yom Liyom. It says it has to be a Chazaka of 3 years from day to day. That sounds like it has to be consecutive years. The Gemara says, not necessarily. Ma'u Detema, what might you have said? Miyom Liyom La'afuke Mikutos. It says Miyom Liyom. That's to exclude partial years, like we see later in the Mishnah, that certain situations you can have partial years. It doesn't have to be 3 full years. Well, Liolam Afilam Mefuzars, and really maybe it could be scattered. Maybe it doesn't have to be consecutive. Kamash Malon. So that's what Rav Huna is teaching us, that it has to be 3 consecutive years. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chama says, Umodi Rav Huna would admit, meaning he would admit that it does not have to be consecutive, Biasre Demovre Bagi, in a place where it's the general custom to let the land lay fallow. There are some areas where they want to let the land lay fallow a little bit. It's better for the long-term production of the produce from this particular land. So if that's what they do in this particular place, so then he can do that as well. It doesn't have to be 3 consecutive years in such a case. The Gemara says, Pshit, isn't that obvious if that's the way they generally work this land? And the Gemara says, Lo no tzrich, it's necessary. Dika demover, vika delomover. Let's say it's a situation where some people let it lay fallow and some don't let it lay fallow. V'hai gavra mover, and this person, he does let his land lay fallow. So what Tama, you have said, Amarle, he can say to him, Emisa dididachava, if it really is your land, you should have planted it. You should have planted it in consecutive years. Kamash Malan, and so that's what it's teaching us over here. Diamarle, that he can say back to him, Chada Ara Bekule Baga. Let's say I have this one parcel of land among a much larger area of land. So if I'm going to just plant this land, because it has to be consecutive to establish a chazaka, but all the other land we're going to let it lay fallow, lo matzina linter, I can't afford to watch just that one piece of land once I'm already letting everything else lay fallow, so I let this lay fallow as well. He can make that as an argument, and that's why Rav Huna is saying in such a situation he can establish a chazaka even if it's not 3 consecutive years. V'inami or b'hachi nichli, he could simply argue that I prefer to let it lay fallow a little da'av d'tfei, because then in the future it's going to be able to produce more. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah Chezkas Habatim, there's an idea of making a chazaka 3 years on a house. And so the Gemara asks, when it comes to houses, people know that the person was there in the daytime, but they don't know at night, so it's not consecutive. That would seem to indicate that you don't need a consecutive 3 years for chazaka. And the Gemara says to that, Omar Abaya says, Man Masra Batim, who's the one that's even testifying on the chazaka, on the houses? Shivave, it's the neighbors. Shivave Meida Yodi B'Yamamu V'Lelia. The neighbors know that he was there both during the day and at night. Amar Rava says a different answer could go into Asu Betray, the case where you can establish a chazak on a house day and night consecutive, is let's say 2 people come, V'Amri, and they say, Anon Agrinon Mine, that we were renting the house from him, meaning the person making the chazak was actually renting out the house to 2 people, so now they're essentially witnesses that they are there, V'Darinon Beit, Lashinin, B'Imam V'Lelia, we lived there for 3 years, day and night, so now you have testimony that he has a chazaka there for 3 consecutive years, day and night. And the Gemara says that wouldn't be a good testimony. Amar le Rav Yemer le Rav Ashi. Rav Yemer said to Rav Ashi, but Hani Nogan Beidusanein, how could you have such a case? That would be a case where they're Nogeya Beidus, meaning they have a self-interest over here to say that in fact he really did rent it out to them. Because the Lo Amri Hachi, because if they don't say that, Amrin and Lahu, then we're going to say to them, Zilu Havule Agar Beisalahai, go give the rent to this other person. In other words, they rented it from this particular individual, and they want to confirm that it belongs to that individual. Otherwise, they have to pay the rent to someone else. So that would not be a good example of witnesses coming forward and testifying to the chazaka consecutive day and night. Amar Le, so he said back to him, Dayani Deshvili, would be low-level judges, Hachi Doini, that would judge like that. Meaning to say, of course that is true. We would never trust them because they are Nogeya Be'edus in the case you set up, but we can set up a case where they're not Nogeya Be'edus. Milo Askinon, couldn't we be dealing with the following case? Could go in the Nikiti Agar Besa. The case is where these people who are testifying, essentially the renters who are testifying to the person who rented it out to them, to his chazaka, they're holding the rent in their hand right now. V'amri, and they're saying, Laman Leisve, who should we give the rent to? So here they're not Nogeya Bedavar at all. We're going to determine who the real owner is. And so then their testimony that they rented it from this particular person, and now it's a 3-year chazaka, there would be no negiya in that situation, no self-interest, and that would be a good testimony. And the Gemara continues, Amar Marzutra says, V'itoyin v'amar, now if he claims and says, Leisu tre sahadi lasude le, the dorbe telos shani, that this person needs to bring 2 witnesses who testify that he was living there for 3 years, b'yamamu v'lelia, day and night, ta'anose ta'ina, then that claim is considered a good claim. And the way the Rashbam understands Marzutra is that in general, when a person brings the evidence that he was there for 3 years, 3 consecutive years to establish a chazaka, he doesn't really need to bring testimony that he was there day and night. He just brings general testimony, and we accept that he's there day and night. And Marzutra is saying that's true in general, but if the other person comes and he says, no, I want to see actual evidence that you were there at night as well, that's the only reason I didn't protest, was because I knew you were not there at night. If the person actually makes that claim as part of his protest, so then the other individual who's making the chazaka will in fact need to bring witnesses that he was there both during the day and at night, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis.